Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smuller. I am the Director of Educational Programs here with the Journey Through Hallowed Ground. And today we are continuing our journey throughout the different sites across this heritage area. And we are joined today by the Education Director at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. So John, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yes, it's a thrill to be with you all. We were just talking beforehand. We do a lot of our own video programming at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm often in Katie's spot, and it's fun to be on the other side of things with this. And I know that a big part of this is a Q&A sort of situation. So please ask questions however you want to ask them, whether it's in the comments or however that they'll make their way to me, and I'm happy to get a discussion going. I like to keep it conversational. So as Katie mentioned, I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We're located in downtown Frederick, Maryland, right on Patrick Street, just a block away from as downtown and downtown Frederick as you could possibly be. We'd love to have you come visit if you've never been before. We're open right now Thursday through Sunday for walk-ins, but if you want to make an appointment to come Monday through Wednesday when we're closed to the public, you can do that on our website, which is civilwarmed.org. So you can come visit us any day of the week, but if you're coming Monday through Wednesday, just give us a heads up so we can be on the lookout for you. We also operate other sites. We have 3 total sites that we operate. Our main location is here in Frederick, which is where I am right now. We also operate the Pry House Field Hospital Museum. That's over on Antietam National Battlefield, and that's going to be open Saturdays, beginning actually this Saturday, June 4th in 2022, and we'll be open every Saturday from this Saturday through, I believe, November it is that we're open out there. So go check us out there. And then finally, the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum is the other location that we operate. That's located in downtown Washington, D.C., around the corner from Capital One Arena. It's where Clara Barton lived and worked during and after the Civil War, and where she became one of the most famous women in not just American history, but internationally famous. And Clara Barton does all kinds of exciting things while she's there. Unfortunately, we're between site managers there at the moment, and so we're only open for groups of 10 or more at this time. We're hoping that'll change as the summer progresses, but that's where we sit right now. So that's a little bit about where we are. Now, what do we talk about at these sites? Well, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine is where we tell across 2 floors, 8,000 square feet of exhibit space. We tell the story of Civil War medicine, which I think surprises a lot of folks. Now, you watching on the Journey Through Hallowed Ground National Heritage Area, you probably maybe have a leg up on some folks that might come through our doors. You might know some things about Civil War medicine. I certainly didn't when I started working here a little bit over 5 years ago, and it's been a thrill to be able to learn more and more about the subject over my time here. And what I mean by that, it surprises a lot of folks. There are a lot of really common misconceptions that a lot of people have about Civil War medicine. Most of them, when Civil War medicine comes to mind, I'm sure all of you think about Civil War medicine on a daily basis, as I do. Just kidding, I don't expect you to do that, but maybe you do, I don't know. Anyway, not a lot of warm, fuzzy feelings come to mind for most folks. Amputations, hacking limbs off, shots of whiskey, no anesthesia, they're biting the bullet or biting on a leather strap or something like that. Just not ideal, in short. And while there's a lot about Civil War medicine that certainly you wouldn't describe as ideal, it's a lot better than most people give it credit for. And so I'll just, over the next few minutes here, I'll take you on a kind of a whirlwind tour through the world of Civil War medicine, starting with what the doctors knew going into the Civil War, and under the category of what is not ideal about Civil War medicine, in medical school leading into the Civil War, they're not learning about germ theory. So germ theory had not been discovered by the time of the Civil War. And this goes on to have disastrous consequences, which I'll speak to in just a second. So in the back of your mind, as I'm talking, just know no one's washing their hands with any regularity. It's quite gross and deadly and when it's all said and done. But what they do have a pretty clear understanding of is just how the human body works. Bones, organs, where they are, what they do, all that sort of thing. They're very well acquainted with the human body. The first job of a Civil War surgeon when the war breaks out is to give physical exams to recruits that come in the Army, much as happens today if you want to join the Army. And in some ways, they're recognizable to us. They're making sure everyone's got all their fingers and toes and things, but they're not so good at screening out infectious diseases. They, for one thing, don't have many vaccines available to them, although they did have one. There was a smallpox vaccine that existed at the time of the Civil War. It actually dramatically predates the Civil War. It's discovered in the late 1700s. And so that was a requirement to serve in the Army. You had to be vaccinated against smallpox. And for that reason, in both armies, there was not a major smallpox outbreak. Now, the mechanism for how this happens was quite crude. They take a bit of cowpox, a scab from cowpox. They sort of cut a hole in your arm and just sort of shove it in there. Gross, unsanitary, but effective when it's all said and done, which is really most of what you need to know about Civil War medicine. It's gross, it's a little unsanitary, but it's reasonably effective. So once the physical exams have been done, soldiers go off to camp, which is the deadliest place to be if you're a Civil War soldier. And that has everything to do with lack of knowledge of germ theory. Camps are crowded, people are living in close quarters, no one's bathing with any degree of regularity. People are sort of going to the bathroom wherever they want. It's not a good place. And knowing this, it will not shock you when I say that of all Civil War deaths, 2/3 of all Civil War deaths come as a result of disease, and only 1/3 comes from battlefield injury. So disease, and that's why I say camp is the most deadly place for a Civil War soldier. Because literally more soldiers die not on the battlefield. Now you need to qualify that statistic, obviously. Depends on which battle you're engaged in, how heavily engaged your unit is. So that's not an absolute statement, but generally speaking, you're more likely to die sitting in camp than you are on the front lines. Now the medicine of Civil War medicine, it's kind of all over the place. There's some good stuff and some bad stuff. For example, we have malaria, quinine available as medicine during the Civil War. It's an effective treatment for malaria. So if you are sick with malaria during the war, you're probably going to be fine. A lot of opium-based medications, morphine and such, given to manage pain. So that's all right. But on the other side of things, you have mercury dispensed liberally during the Civil War. So that's not so good. Once you actually get to the battlefield, this is where Civil War medicine really starts to shine. In the early days of the Civil War, as the military medical departments were coming to grips with the scale of the conflict, there was no ambulance corps, which seems silly to us today. There was no dedicated system to evacuate soldiers from the battlefield into hospitals. And this becomes apparent immediately. The first major battle of the Civil War, Battle of First Bull Run, 5,000 total casualties. Some of them are waiting for medical care for 5 to 7 days. I mean, it's a disaster. You couldn't do a worse job. And so someone by the name of Jonathan Letterman is ultimately appointed to be the medical director of the Union Army of the Potomac. Letterman revolutionizes battlefield medicine as we know it today. For starters, he creates the ambulance corps, a dedicated group of trained people. The ambulance corps debuts at the Battle of Antietam, and the bloodiest single day in American history, 23,000 casualties in a single day. And within 24 hours of the end of the battle, all wounded soldiers are off the field and into hospitals. So it's a remarkable improvement in just a year and some change that a dedicated trained group of people affect on the battlefield. In addition to that, Letterman puts together a system of care, very creatively called the Letterman system, which is designed to care for wounded soldiers from the moment they're injured all the way through long-term recovery. There are three parts of this plan. Number one, the field dressing station. This is the job of these assistant surgeons. They're close to the battlefield. Their job is to stop the bleeding with bandages, tourniquets, etc. And then they perform triage. It's the first time triage was instituted in American medical military history. They're not using the word triage, but they're prioritizing the wounded according to the severity of the injury. Now, ideally, Civil War battles certainly were not ideal situations, but ideally, ambulances of the ambulance corps were to wait by these field dressing stations where basically first aid is performed, and then take them back to the field hospital. We still see an example of this in our world today. If you've been to any large outdoor gathering, a concert, festival, county fair, you name it, you've probably seen the white medical tent with the red cross, and you've often seen an ambulance waiting right there. That's directly from the mind of Jonathan Letterman and Civil War medicine, and we still benefit from it today because it's a great idea. So once the patient gets back to a field hospital, typically a mile or two behind the lines, that's where the procedures happen, the surgery takes place. Amputations most commonly. Most common procedure, 60,000 amputations done during the Civil War, a shocking number. And it's so common because the type of ammunition being used, bullets, when it strikes human bone, would shatter the bone as opposed to break it. A fracture or a clean break, you put a cast on it or a splint. They had splints during the Civil War. Don't bang your arm into a wall, it'll put itself back together. Clearly, I'm not a doctor, but the human body is amazing. A shattered bone we can deal with today, plates and screws and pins and things. They cannot at the time of the Civil War. So that's why they go for amputations. Now, here's one of the biggest myths when it comes to Civil War medicine. They did have anesthesia at the time of the Civil War. It was common. Over 95% of Civil War surgeries used anesthesia. So if you remember any one little fact, if you want to impress your friends and amaze people in your circle, you can tell them 95% of all Civil War surgery used anesthesia. We're talking chloroform and ether, but I don't really care what it is. If I've just been shot and I'm going to have an amputation, I'll take whatever you got. Now, how likely are you to survive an amputation? Depends on what you had amputated. Again, I'm not a doctor, but this makes sense to me. The further away from the core of your body the amputation was, more likely you are to survive. That kind of makes sense, right? So the mortality rates ranged from a finger or a toe, 2 to 4% mortality rate, all the way up to an amputation at the hip joint. That was an 83% mortality rate. If you average it all out, it works out to about a 26% mortality rate for amputations throughout the war. That sounds okay. It sounds a little better when you compare it to the mortality rate for civilian amputations before the war. That was 50%. So you're actually twice as likely to survive an amputation during the Civil War as you would have been before the Civil War, which I think has a lot to do with the Letterman plan, quickly getting the patients into the hospitals. And then finally, the last part of the Letterman plan is something called the General Hospital. This is a purpose-built hospital facility, usually located in larger cities like your DCs, your Baltimores, Richmonds, etc. And they could hold several thousand patients at a time. And it's here where Civil War surgeons, they start to observe things. They're keeping careful records. We have voluminous records from Civil War surgeons. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. If you type that into Google, you can find it. It's all available for free online. If you try to read it cover to cover, it'll put you right to sleep, but the information in there is excellent. And so at these general hospitals, surgeons start to realize things that, for example, cleanliness seems to be correlated with good health. Why? They're not terribly sure, but they're in the business of saving lives. So they require that patients be cleaned every single day, their clothes cleaned every single day, and their bed sheets cleaned every single day. And they start to notice that survival rates go up. Likewise, they notice that good airflow seems to be related to good health, something that we've kind of reacquainted ourselves with in the past several years here. And so they require windows be kept open at all times in Civil War hospitals. Why that is the case, they're not totally sure. And then the goofiest of all the regulations they put in place is they see that things that smell good seem to be healthier than things that smell bad. So they hang pine branches at all times in the hospitals. And while a little aromatherapy wasn't going to hurt anybody, it's not exactly going to save someone who's afflicted with typhoid fever. So all of these innovations, if you squint, they get close to discovering something that we might recognize as germ theory, but they don't totally get there. But all of this means that in these general hospitals, the mortality rate is only about 8%. So if you make it to a general hospital, you're probably going to be fine. So this Letterman system, the field dressing station, the field hospital, and the general hospital, still used by our military today. It's been updated. Obviously, we know about germ theory. We have, motorized vehicles, helicopters instead of wagons to evacuate people. But the structure of the Letterman plan and the way that we evacuate wounded soldiers has not really changed since the Civil War. So that's one specific way that we still benefit from Civil War medicine. So to kind of conclude here, and we can get to some questions, Civil War medicine, it's not modern medicine. We shouldn't confuse it for that, but it's not this kind of pre-modern, horrific, barbaric thing it's sometimes made out to be. Rather, it occupies what I think is a really interesting kind of in-between space where it lays the foundation for a lot of the modern practices that we can kind of recognize. And even those we don't, they're just discernible enough that like, oh, okay, I could see how that maybe evolved into X, Y, or Z. So I think Civil War medicine is fascinating, and I hope I've enticed you to maybe pay us a visit sometime this summer at any of our locations. And we hope to see you, and I look forward to hearing what you all have to say.
Yeah, John, that was great. We got lots of questions here, so we're gonna bring on Ben Kellerhals. He's our intern here with the program. So Ben, if you wanna start reading some of those questions for us, that would be great.
Yes, hi, John. Great presentation, and we'll just jump into some questions. Active folks, how did the museum get started? And are there other museums like this in other parts of the country?
That's a great question. So we actually have not been around all that long. We've existed as an entity since the early to mid 90s. And in our current iteration here in downtown Frederick, we've only been here since 2000. So in the scheme of things, we're a pretty recent organization. We were founded basically by a collector. His name is Dr. Gordon Dahman. He's a now retired dentist from the Chicago area who just collected Civil War medicine things. And one day he decided he's going to open a museum. And so he did. And, we've accumulated since then quite a few other objects as well. But we've grown since then, but that's how we got started. As for other museums kind of like us, there's a great place that dates to the Civil War, actually. Was originally the Army Medical Museum. It was founded for the purpose of collecting medical specimens so that we could learn from the medical experience of the Civil War. But they continued long after the war. Today, they're known as the National Museum of Health and Medicine. They've bounced around a few times. They've been in a few different locations. At one point, they were on the National Mall. For a long time, they were in Walter Reed Hospital. And as of maybe it's a decade now, or a little less than that, but they are now in Silver Spring, Maryland. It's kind of a curious setup. They're half on an Army base and half off. So you don't need military clearance to visit the museum. The public facing access is off the military base, and the line of the base goes right through the museum, and the collections room and the staff offices are on the military base. So it's kind of an odd setup, but it's a really cool museum, would recommend. And as for other Civil War medicine sites, you'll find a place here or there. Most of them are out east, but I'm sure there are medically oriented museums a bit further west related to the Civil War. I'm thinking of things like Ben Lomond site that's on the Manassas battlefield. That was a field hospital. There's a place down in Virginia, and of course, I'm not going to remember it. I want to say it's in like Gordonsville or something. It talks more about Confederate medicine. And then the Mutter Museum up in Philadelphia, which is more sort of medical curiosities. Anyway, there's all kinds of cool medical museums out there. Yeah.
Great. That's a lot of great information, and I'm sure everyone's looking forward to seeing these kinds of places in real life.
Yes.
Next question would be, were operations for appendicitis or gallbladders done? Were those done in the Civil War?
Great question. And I see that is from Barbara Schultz. She's a faithful viewer of some of our videos, so it's great to see you, Barbara. I don't know the answer in full, although it's funny you ask that. Very serendipitously, just a few hours ago, I was looking in the index for the medical and surgical history with one of our interns on an unrelated project, and I just happened to flip open, and I saw there's a whole section on gallbladders. So I don't know what sort of operations they did or didn't do off the top of my head, but I do know that gallbladders at least come up in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. So there's some awareness of them, and they're doing something with them. It wasn't a huge section, I'll note, but there were several entries there. So there's stuff out there about it. I just don't happen to know what it is. And I'm not too sure about appendixes, whatever the plural for that is. I'm not sure about that either. Because I didn't happen to accidentally see that in the index when I was flipping through. But I don't know, but it's a great question. Probably, they had a pretty good understanding of anatomy going into the Civil War, so I'm sure there's at least some small section of that.
Thank you. This next one will combine sort of two, I think, related questions. So one being, how quickly did medical advancements from the war carry into civilian life, and likewise, were civilian hospitals suffering during the war with doctors and supplies being so sent away to soldiers?
Those are great questions. Really, really good. It's not exactly a linear path between how the innovations from the Civil War translate into the civilian world. It does happen, but it's not instantaneous. One way that is quicker than others is after the Civil War, people who were veterans in the ambulance corps go back to their hometowns and they start independent ambulance companies around the country. The very first happened almost immediately after the Civil War, one in New York City, and I want to say there's another one in like Cincinnati or something like that. I'm not positive, but there are two that are formed in like late 65 or early 66. I mean, pretty immediately. And more of those pop up as time goes on. So, you know, firehouses, of course, were pretty pervasive throughout the country, you know, before the Civil War, but in like an ambulance service, not so much. That comes as a result of the Civil War. So that's one specific concrete way that it positively impacts, you know, the regular citizenry. Another, again, that takes a little bit of time, but comes sooner rather than later, are medical specializations. So before the Civil War, if you're a doctor, even in a big city, you're only going to see so many patients in a given year. And because of that, you need to be kind of a jack of all trades. You need to be good at everything. But during the Civil War, suddenly there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of patients covering all, you know, the whole spectrum of, diseases and things or wounds or what have you. And so medical specializations start coming into being. Suddenly there are people that specialize in cardiology, fields of cardiology, neurology, um, reconstructive surgery, all these kind of new specializations come into being. And so one of the benefits that comes to regular citizens is individual hospitals start to open up, especially in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was sort of the medical capital of the United States. And you could argue that after the Civil War, even of the world. Paris was the medical capital of the world before the Civil War, and Philadelphia eventually comes to sort of rival it. But especially in Philadelphia, these specialized hospitals for cardiology, neurology, and other things start coming into being. So if you have like a rare heart condition, you now have someone that you can go to besides just your local physician. So that's another way that things start, coming to benefit the people. But Civil War surgeons found the American Medical Association. That comes into being after the Civil War, and they start collecting research and stuff, and those benefits maybe take a little bit longer to trickle down, but it all kind of gets a jump start during the Civil War. Now, were civilian hospitals suffering because of all these military surgeons, these people who might otherwise be on the home front doing military surgery and stuff? Hard to say. Civilian hospitals weren't great to begin with. In the 19th century, hospitals were where you went to die, not where you went when you felt sick. That was kind of a last resort. Doctors were looked upon as sort of sketchy characters at times, especially in the decades before the Civil War. Bodies were not given to medical schools, or very few were for dissection, because it was thought that if you dissected a body, you were committing them to sort of a second death. There would be no physical body to be raised up with Christ at the end of times. So it was frowned upon. And so physicians or medical schools would turn to grave robbing and body snatching, dig up dead bodies and bring them back to the medical school. And this wasn't very popular if people discovered this. And so because of that, there were about 17 different what we call anatomy riots before the Civil War, people storming the local medical school, burning it down. And so this is because of this, doctors like kind of sketchy people, like what are they doing behind those closed doors? Who are they cutting up now? So there's a reluctance to go to the hospital beforehand. And so hospitals are not very savory places. So to get back to the question, there wasn't a lot of quality for them to lose, but I can't imagine that the quality sort of improved as the war was going on. Yeah, so that's sort of a roundabout way of saying I'm not exactly positive, how that, how regular citizens would have accessed medical care during the war, but I don't imagine it would have been certainly dramatically better as the war was happening. But after the war, they start to, over time, reap some of those benefits.
Thank you. We can see as a theme throughout American history and all over the world, the public trust between the medical community and the community at large, right? That ever-shifting dynamic. So our next question would be, since military surgeons of the day were carrying out operations barehanded, if the wounded soldier has a transmissible disease, what percentage of surgeons would become infected?
I wish I had a better answer for that, or even just, not even just infected, but just sick. It shocks me that it's not conspicuously higher. And, here's a harebrained take that, again, betrays I'm not a doctor. Perhaps because they're just constantly around some of this stuff, their immune systems were better. I don't know. I mean, the question is a good one in that you would have to assume that they're just constantly around these sick people. How are the doctors themselves not basically constantly sick? And in all of my kind of goings through, this is more anecdotal, but just going through surgeons' letters and diaries, it's very rare, seemingly, that they come down with something, at least anything serious that they comment on. So I don't know why that is, but it didn't seem to have happened terribly often. Now, it did happen. I'm not trying to tell you they had, they're batting 1,000 against sickness, but it didn't seem to happen as much as perhaps you might think it would. And the answer to that, your guess is as good as mine.
Thank you. Next, I'll also try and combine two questions. We just have so many good ones, I think. One being, where were field surgeons trained? And another one, also somewhat geographically related, being which army, if one was, which was better at medicine and at affecting these things after battles?
Sure. So not dissimilar from West Point. People ask the question, did one side have better generals? Maybe you could make an argument for one or the other, but at the end of the day, they're all trained at the same schools, West Point or VMI or something like that. And basically a general is going to be, if they all get equal training, more or less, then I guess it's just maybe one person had a greater aptitude for it, and that's all there is. So for the most part, a lot of it's not quite as centralized as one place like West Point, for example, but surgeons go to medical school all around the country, but they're getting a lot of the same curriculum, and they're facing a lot of the same challenges, like I talked about, not doing a lot of dissections, for example, and they're learning a lot of the same curriculum. Jefferson Medical College was probably the most popular, and that was in Philadelphia, like I mentioned. That was probably the most prestigious of medical schools that were out there. But there were plenty around the country. So they got trained any number of places. And that training was, as far as we can tell, pretty, standard across the board, both North and South. So was one side better than the other? Not that we can detect, unless some radical new piece of evidence suddenly falls from the sky. But from what we know, it seems to be the medical care was pretty standard between both sides. And the wording of the question, where were field surgeons trained? I want to focus on the word field. They all go to medical school, but most doctors before the Civil War had not performed many or perhaps even any surgery before, because of, like I mentioned, lack of dissections, and B, anesthesia, even though it's pervasive by the time we get to the Civil War, especially in the early days of its discovery in the late 1840s, people are not exactly lining up to go under the knife with this newfangled thing. So there's just not a lot of opportunity for operations out there. So when you mentioned where are field surgeons trained, in the field for the most part, they get on the job training in trial by fire, really. And so, at the start of the war, they're relatively inexpert. Before long, they're some of the most skilled surgeons really on planet Earth by the time the Civil War is over. So it's field training and some book learning before the war.
Very interesting. Thank you. Next up, we know that generally understanding the Civil War's timeline, that a large discussion back and forth and then subsequent decision was to utilize freed Black Americans in the fight. Were there disparities in how medicine treatment occurred once there were soldiers of color on the battlefields?
That's a great question. Well, for starters, I'll note that in the Union Army, there were 13 African-American surgeons that served during the conflict. Of course, none in the Southern forces. I think it's 3 of them, maybe more than that. Not all of them were employed by the United States military. Some of them were contract surgeons, which work very similar to government contractors today. In the event of a battle, or they'll show up at a hospital and they get paid, month to month, as long as their services are needed. So for starters, there were some African-American surgeons, And we don't have time to get into his story here, but if you want to look up the story of an incredible person, look up Alexander Augusta. He does all kinds of incredible stuff. In addition to being a surgeon, he like single-handedly desegregates Washington, D.C. public transportation during the war. It's a wild thing. Anyway, how medical care compared and contrasted between white soldiers and black soldiers once they enter the fight for the Union. We have a lot of raw numbers with this in the medical and surgical history. They're, again, they're all about just knowledge collection. And so for the disease statistics, I'm not sure if they differentiate it by battlefield injury, but for disease statistics, they have, here's all Union soldiers, here's white soldiers, and here's African-American soldiers. So we have a lot of great numbers, and there's some kind of curious disparities here and there. A lot of them are similar between white and black soldiers, but not all. And some, there's a lot of theories as to why this is. The authors of the medical and surgical history put forward their own guesses. Scholars have put forward several others. To me, one of the more compelling is that a lot of the USCT soldiers were formerly enslaved, and generally speaking, not as high nutrition of a diet. And so their bodies perhaps are a bit weaker, a little more susceptible to disease and things of that nature. I find that sort of a compelling reason for why that might be the case. But there's a lot of theories on that. Now, in terms of the quality of care that they receive, it's a little bit harder to pinpoint specifically. We actually have been doing a little bit of research, or it's just begun some research to that point on our own. Certainly I would be shocked if they face no prejudice whatsoever when it comes to medical care. You have to imagine that appeared here and there, but there were, medical care was provided to them, to African-American, not just soldiers, but also some of the families and the runaways in the refugee camps that pop up really all over the country. And I know we've spoken about this. There's some, with some people we've had on some of our own video programming, which you can find on our Facebook page or YouTube channel. We've talked with Chandra Manning about her book, Troubled Refuge, which is about these refugee camps, and Amy Merle Taylor, her book, Embattled Freedom. So I talked a little bit about it with them there, and I'd point you to those. But it's hard to get an exact portrait of that, again, because the sourcing can be a little shaky sometimes in those situations, because what the doctors report might not perfectly reflect certainly how the Black patient may have felt about it, or what have you. So it's a complicated question, complicated answer, and a roundabout way of saying I'm not totally sure.
Well, thank you. Very informative, as you have been with all these questions. And we could go on for hours, but we don't want to take up your entire day. So I'd like to close with a final question that we asked some of our great guides at these sites through the Journey Through Hallowed Ground Heritage Area, which is, how did you get here, John? What advice might you have for someone watching that loves what you're talking about and is interested in doing something else, whether that be a student or someone older?
Sure. That's a great question. So I've been here at the museum for 5 years, and before that, I was a seasonal park ranger at Harper's Ferry National Historical Park, which is fantastic if you've never been. So I started off initially as an intern at Harper's Ferry, and then was a seasonal for successive summers while I was in school, undergrad and then graduate school. I ended up with a master's in public history. I knew I was moving to this area, and so I sort of cold called and beat down the doors of a bunch of museums in the area, and I very serendipitously happened to wind up in a position here. And it's been delightful. So, I mean, in terms of advice, just getting out there and doing things. School is undoubtedly useful, and depending on what your specific goal is, even a PhD is helpful. But to me, for how my life trajectory was shaping, a PhD didn't end up being all that useful for me. And so I was in a PhD program and I dropped out. I left with my master's degree. And it was a good decision for me. Some people are more built for that than say I was, that PhD program. So that's a fine way to go, but it's a tough road for the people in my cohort that I'm still in touch with. It's challenging. Not saying it's impossible or even to dissuade you, but just it's not for the faint-hearted. But honestly, if you are willing to relocate, there's a lot of great options out there in the museum world. Keep an eye on job boards. Something like the National Council for Public History has a great job board. The AASLH or something. I don't think that's the right acronym. And AAM, American Alliance of Museums. That's what it is. They have another great job board. So, just look at those, and there's stuff that's open all over the place. And these days, I'm sure you can find, more remote work than, you used to be able to find. So there's that. But if you have a specific area, it's old fashioned, but just sending cold call emails and phone calls and stuff. I mean, that honestly worked for me. And at the end of the day, just be passionate about it, because people can see through it if you're not. You don't need to be a subject matter expert, but just be excited about it, about what you're doing. And if you're really passionate about it, I believe that'll, get you where you need to go when it's all said and done.
John, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and answering all these questions. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun to be here and really, really engaging questions. Thank you.
Yes, I think we got to just about most of them. I did put the link to the website in the chat though, so anyone interested in learning more, feel free to check it out or
thank you. Check out our website, civilwarmed.org. But if you want to continue the conversation, we're probably most responsive on Facebook. Our Facebook page, where we monitor pretty regularly. So if you ask a question there, it'll probably find its way to me in some form or other.
Perfect. Thank you so much again, John. And thank you everyone at home for tuning in. We'll be back here next week and hope to see you there.